The 1940 Census Schedule. This is another JDW Talks. My targeted audience are genealogists, census researchers, sociologists, historians, and students. I have a handout for this talk. You see my Dropbox URL there, and a little bit about me. I have a link to my little website. This was recorded at the end of May 2020. So what was it like to live in 1940? A war was raging in Europe. Minimum wage was 30 cents an hour. Cost of living doesn't look like much considering today. First class mail was 3 cents and a loaf of bread cost 8 cents. Unemployment was about 15%. And unfortunately today it's a lot higher than that. And the census day was April 1st, 1940. So let's go through a bunch of definitions to make sure that we're all on the same page. A census is a count, a human count in this case, and we're using the Norman Rockwell 1940 cover. The enumerator is this person doing the count. You notice he's protecting what he is writing from the person. The enumeration is taking the count. And what we're looking forward to is the schedules. This is a count that's already become public. And so you can go and look at the schedules of the results of the count. The federal census mandates that every 10 years since 1790, the census has been taken in the United States. The questions may differ between years, and we now wait 72 years after a count is taken before we can see it, before it is released to the public. And I have an article on the origin of that. It has nothing to do with life expectancy, and I will have on my channel, my YouTube channel, a whole talk on the origin of the 72-year rule. So here I am with a poster from the 1940 census. There was lots and lots of publicity, unlike the 1950 census. It opened on April 2nd, 2012, because the first was a Sunday, and it was all online. Some of the previous ones, you had to go to a National Archives to see the release of the film. So it was all digital. It was really great. And of course, it was free. It was done by the National Archives. However, when it opened, there was no name index. You'd have to look through 3.8 million images. Maybe you got lucky and your person was in the first couple of images. You needed a 1940 location, and you needed to translate that into a census district number. So a consortium of groups got together and decided to make a big crowdsourcing project to name index this census. You can see some of the organizations that were involved in this. The lead organization was Family Search. It's pretty amazing. So 4 months after the opening of this 1940 project, they had 160,000 people, volunteers, who name indexed the census. And that index is freely available and online. Name indexes are efficient ways of finding people. You don't have to know very much about the census format. It takes you right to, if you get a result and click on the next step, it'll get you directly to the right page. Initially, there was a number of groups that provided indexes, but remember there is a free one as well. So there are a number of subscription services that have name indexes, not only for this one, but other ones as well. However, I would suggest certain things. If you're doing name search situations, you should know about some shortcuts or some hints. You should be able to use wildcards. A wildcard fills in the rest of a name. So for instance, if we had someone by the name of Smith or Smithson, etc., you can just put in SMI and an asterisk and get all those people. If you're not sure about a letter, for instance, so that my second example here, you can put a question mark in, and the question mark will fill in any letter. Also remember that you shouldn't be too specific when you're doing name searches. That less is more. Don't, less is more. Search for children. If you really have trouble, maybe don't use their last name. Maybe it was mistranscribed on the index. And in general, in any sort of search, you need to relax your assumptions because you will find variations in names that you don't expect. Take it from the transcriber's viewpoint. They're working perhaps with poor quality census images. Remember, these are images. These are not the actual census. There may be lots of problems with the image, and I show you some of them here. And I've seen really bad ones. There's an interpretation problem of handwriting. They didn't print it. They did handwriting. Even though the census takers were supposed to be tested for their handwriting, you saw from the original Norman Rockwell that he was writing standing up. Within this portfolio, very difficult. English might not have been the primary language of the people who were being enumerated, and the transcribers were told to write what you see. And that leads to some funny things like a first and last name reversal, that it was obvious that they were reversed, but the transcriber wrote it so that the first name appears as the last name on the index. There are other ways of searching, however, and that is by searching by location. The 1940 census had census maps. There were definitions and descriptions of each census district. We created street lists within census districts. We'll talk about that. And we also had a table where if you had a 1930 enumeration district, a district number, you could find them in 1940, providing they did not move. And the locational tools, a lot of those are on the one-step web pages by Stephen P. Morse. This is a free website. It's at stevemorse.org. It's not .com, who is a professional musician. And this slide actually comes from the original 1940 PowerPoint I did. Now Steve has over 300 utilities on it. This is the part of the website that deals with census utilities. As you can see, there's quite a number of them. The important tool is the unified 1880 to 1950 tool that's toward the top. If you notice on the top, there are a number of aids to help you search by location for the 1940 census. There's a tutorial quiz, and there are some articles as well. Actually, if you were to look at this page today, you would see a whole bunch of additional aids, but that's for the 1950 census. I'm not going to really talk about how to use our locational tools. If you want to get a lesson in that, then take a look at my YouTube video on the 1950 census, searching by location, and you have a clear understanding of what those tools do. Steve and I formed a partnership in January of 2002 for the 1930 census, and we have worked together ever since. So it's an important website, probably the only one that has these massive number of locational tools. When the 1940 census came out, the website that the National Archives was associated with was very, very popular. They used locational tools. You can see on the left, you can search by location, and on the right, you could search if you knew the enumeration district. And if you look closely, our work, Steve and myself work, is acknowledged. We loaned them that information. Also, the New York Public Library took advantage of our databases. We offered our databases to any concern that wanted to use it, freely offered them it. There were some stipulations about maintaining quality of the work and acknowledgement of the one-step website. So New York Public Library took advantage of that. They digitized all their phone books, all their phone directories, and then if you found a person in the phone directory, they provided a link to the one-step site. In fact, they had the databases there so that you can go right to that. In addition to that, the subscription service Ancestry.com, before they had their own name index, used our databases, as you can see. So location searches are good if there isn't a name index. Obviously, there was not one on the censuses when they opened because of confidentiality. Sometimes name indexes fail. We've showed you some of the reasons why. To document a missed residence. In other words, if you can't find somebody with a name index, you may not know, well, maybe it was mistranscribed. Maybe I should do some variations of the name. But if you knew an address and then looked up the district that address was supposed to be in and found out that the census taker skipped that house, or no one was home and they did not respond to a absentee census that was left there, then you know that you're out of luck. In large cities with lots of John Smiths, it might be easier to look up someone by address. People who do academic and economic research often don't care necessarily about the name of the person. They're interested in the location. And surprisingly, for the 1940 census, a number of people were using it to find out the history of their house, about who lived in it 70 plus years earlier. So I'm going to show you, and it's going to be about 10 seconds, a number of places where to look to find a location. And this is not only true in 1940, but for the 1950 census that's coming up in 2022, you'll be faced with the same situation. 10 seconds. Well, maybe it's not 10 seconds. That was what I programmed in the PowerPoint presentation. And of course, you could always freeze your video and then go back again. There was a housing schedule. It was destroyed before filming, so we don't have any results of that. We do have summaries of the information. So we're interested in the population schedule. Here I'm holding what it looks like. This is a blank schedule. I was able to put it in plastic and would pass it around my audiences. I'm not sure with this pandemic whether that's going to work again in the future. If you look at this, you'll see a difference between 1940 and I'll peek a little bit, look at 1930. In 1940, there are 40 entry lines instead of 50. There are 2 lines, and there are supplemental questions on the bottom. We'll talk about that. There are 2 lines that are heavier in the line density, and those are sampling lines. If a name was found on one of those 2 lines, fell on those 2 lines, they were asked the additional questions. So in 1940, the Census Bureau went to a sampling scheme where everybody asked the questions on the top that pertain to them, and then an additional 5% of the people asked additional questions. They were concerned that maybe there was a bias in the lines. And so there were a number of different variations of where those 2 lines were. And within an enumeration district, all the forms were the same, so not to confuse the enumerator. In 1950, within each ED, you will see a variation from one sheet to another. So why did they sample? It was the ability to add more questions. It speeded up the field work. They could analyze the sample questions much faster than the regular questions, and they could publish the information much quicker. Interesting that Hawaii in 1940 had the old form, 50 lines, no sampling. So the coverage was, as you can see, continental U.S. and its territories. And here's the second part of that, although it's not clear to me where the military and naval censuses are found. Now, one of the problems with any census is people who are not counted. That's called an undercount in terms of missed people. It may be due to movement, they refuse to participate, inaccurate enumerator maps, and crowded conditions like large cities, isolated areas like rural areas may be difficult to count and people are missed. And of course, there's human error. So in 1940, the Census Bureau began to estimate the undercount in this 10-year census. And they got an indication that undercounts were a serious problem. 6.5 months after the 1940 census, there was a mandatory selective service registration for males 21 to 35, and that had teeth in it. That there were penalties for non-registration, fines of up to $10,000, and a prison term of up to 5 years. That's not the case of the census. And what they found was that 13% more blacks and 3% more non-blacks in that male age group registered than predicted from the census. So they calculated from that about 8+% of Black Americans and 5% of non-blacks were missed on the 1940 census. Even though the enumerator handbook says that it was your duty personally to visit every household and farm, it wasn't so easy. What would happen if you had a residence that the person wasn't home? As a census taker, you were given a lot of different forms, and this is one area that I'm interested in. I collect information about these enumerators. Here is a card that they were given, a bunch of these, so that you would put it in their mailbox of people who were not home. You could give them an individual census form and leave it to pick it up later, or that larger form was for a family. And so people were given an opportunity, even if they weren't home, to participate. The census taker was also given forms for unusual situations. This is a non-resident schedule. The family or the person was there in this census taker's district, but lived elsewhere. And so there was a special form for that. So let's take a look at this form. It's called a schedule. Let's first look at how the sheets, I think, were numbered. I think that's on my next topic. Yes, and by the way, I'm doing this pretty much without a script and straight through, although I'm coming back and re-recording some slide sequences. So regular coverages that, remember, the housing schedule is a separate schedule, that there is an A side of a schedule and the opposite is a B side. So on the front is 1A and the back is 1B, and then the next sheet starts at 2A, 2B, etc. So let's assume we had something that went up to 43B. The census taker was told to follow up some people whom they missed, to add them to the end of the regular coverage, and to start on sheet numbered 61A. So you could see a gap of numbers between 43B and 61A. In addition to that, there was a special count of transients on 2 days, April 8th and April 9th, and the enumerator was told to put them on a sheet and number that sheet starting with 81A, so that you may see 2 gaps of numbering, and that will confuse you. So here's how to tell whether a sheet is missing. So let's look at the upper right. This is sheet 61A. The sheets were originally blank, and the enumerator put in all those numbers. The enumeration district, the ED number up there, well, I've been using census district, interchangeable, is 31-1995. The 31 is a prefix, which usually denotes a county or a large city. So every ED within that has 31 dash, and this one is the 1995th enumeration district within that prefix. If you look, you'll see that there's a stamped number, 24,428, and only the A sheets are stamped. I mean, it would save them time not to turn over the sheet in addition to their stamping. So 24429 is the next sheet, which starts at 62A. Now, if I'm right about this, of course I'm never wrong on a YouTube video, right? 31 should have a 31-1 as the enumeration district, and the first sheet in that should be 1A, and the number should be 1. So here is 31-1, sheet 1A, and indeed the number is 1. So it's a consecutive sequence of numbers, and if there's a sheet missing, you'll notice it. The enumerator handbook is a very useful tool that describes a lot of the things that I'm talking about. It gives instructions through the enumerators, obviously, but you have an opportunity yourself to get and see a copy of this handbook. And it would be useful to read through it before you look at your schedules, and you get a pretty good idea of the sorts of questions that the enumerator asked. And the way to do that is that the National Archives website in 1940, which I think I have on your handout, but you could always stop the video and take a look here, have links to the enumerator handbook. Very, very useful. I've given you a Dropbox, not a Dropbox, a tiny URL rendition of that long website address. In addition, there are two websites that show you instructions to enumerators from 1850 to 1950. One of them is by the Census Bureau. The other one is by an organization in a university in Minnesota, IPUMS. And I've given you those links, and I think they're also on the handout. You will find that there, another topic, you'll find that there are codes on the census sheet when you look at them. You see here, there's a column for a code, columns for code, leave blank, that's the instructions to the enumerator. Code, leave blank, because after the census is taken, was in 1940, there were lots of people hired just to add codes to that census sheet. And they added the codes in pencil. You can see. We at the One Step site have a utility up that translates the codes to what the code means. And there's Steve, and there's myself. David Case, that's how you pronounce that name, is one of the original people who started this. And unfortunately, Dave is no longer alive. So I want to emphasize this, that these codes were put on the census pages well after the enumeration was done. People think there's some sort of hidden information there, and therefore provide no additional information from the person being enumerated. However, sometimes knowing the code can help you determine the occupation that the code refers to, and there are other codes as well, not just occupation, where the quality of the microfilm is poor or the handwriting of the enumerator is difficult to read. So how do they decide on the questions? Well, everybody wants their question to be asked. They got 6,000 suggestions by several thousand people and a lot of interest groups, and they picked about 50 of them. They rejected questions like, do you own a Bible? Are you over 6 feet tall? What's your hair color? Do you own a burial plot? The number of dogs owned? All sorts of strange questions. Well, the dog-owned one is kind of interesting. I have in my collection here a census of dogs in New York State in 1941. Why would they census dogs? Well, the name of the owner, where they live, the number of dogs, is some sort of kennel or something there, and the license number. And this was very clever, because if you census dogs and the animal doesn't have a license number, you can warn the owner and they would have to get that. So there was money going into the city. In addition to that, this person was bitten by this dog and said, my neighbor has that dog. And he says, I don't know where that dog came from. Here is legal proof. It is actually a sworn statement right there that the person did the census. Counted 492 dogs. Got 20 cents a dog. Earned almost $100. While this same community had two enumerators for 2,000 people, they got 4 cents a name. They split the $85.76 between them. So the moral here is, you do better counting dogs than you would counting people in 1940. Now, as we go through the schedule, there are lots of questions asked. Some of them were asked in a lot of the censuses. You go to the name column, and now there's something different. For the first time, we have the name of the person furnishing the information with an X. Unfortunately, that was dropped for the 1950 census. In addition to that, it turns out that the enumerator was told if nobody's home and you can't get that information, you can have an outside informant give the information, but just put that in the left-hand margin. I think that's always been the case, that the enumerator could get the information wherever they could. And so you might see 2 examples here in that left margin. Information from this person's sister, and this information from this person's brother-in-law, although the information probably is not as good as from the person themselves. You can see there's all sorts of personal description here. And at the bottom of the schedule, to help the enumerator, there are occasionally these sorts of instructions. Race has always been kind of an interesting question that was asked, and you see that the instructions to the enumerators are here. Mexicans were now considered white. They weren't, I guess, before, and Hindu is not a race. A new education question was asked. The idea about whether you could read or write was dropped. And again, the enumerator was given extra help there. And here are the results of a number of different census years. They asked whether if you're 25 years and older, do you have a high school diploma or more? You'll see that in 1940, only 1 out of 4 people had a high school diploma. 1 out of 4. The place of birth is interesting. They dropped the parent's birthplace on the regular form, but not on, I think, on the sample, as we will see. And this was a strange question. If foreign-born give country in which birthplace was situated on January 1st, 1937. Remember, there's a war going on in Europe. And so in 1940, the map of Europe looked quite different than in 1937. And so they turned back the clock to ask that question. That's why they're using 1937. And it says here, and this is a new thing, if you can't determine the location of the birth country for January 1st, 1937, enter the birth province, state, or city name. So you might get some additional information there if you don't know where your immigrant ancestors came from. There was a citizenship question of the foreign-born here, and there's only one citizenship column. You're either, if you're an immigrant, you're either naturalized, you have applied during the process, you haven't, you're an alien, and then there's this American citizen abroad. You are an American citizen. There was a question on previous place of residence, and that was 5 years earlier. Interesting question. And here is a result of that it gives an indication of mobility of people. And you can see that a lot of people moved from North Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, etc. And where did they move to? They moved to California, Nevada, West Coast, and also to Florida. So what's going on? Well, this is, remember, the 1940 census is looking basically at the 1930s. And in the 1930s, there was a major drought in the United States. There wasn't much soil conservation, and it was devastating to Oklahoma, Kansas, all those areas there. And in fact, the cover title that I have shows the desperation people had to move out of that area to other areas of the United States, the Dust Bowl. And there was also, besides that, a double whammy of a Great Depression. And so here we have people lined up for free food. It's ironic, I'm giving this narration in May of 2020, and I see pictures of people lining up for food from food banks. In fact, we donated to the local one to provide some support for them. Anyway, the question about where did you live in 1935 may have a number of different sorts of responses. If you might have the same house or the same place, and then they might ask you about whether you lived on a farm or not. If you had moved, they would want to know where the old house was, and the county, the state, and again a question about farm usually, and there would also be some other questions if you lived in a rural area as well. And if you moved into the US from a foreign country, you'd only have to put down the name of the foreign country. Obviously, there were lots and lots of questions about employment. They were very interested in seeing the impact of both of those crises. And here we have unemployment rates from 1929 to 1939. I think as I'm talking, our unemployment is greater than the 24.9% right now. There are a number of questions about public emergency work, looking for jobs, etc. You can see a difficult period of time. You get a view of your ancestors and their struggles. Employment questions, if you're 14 years or older. And there will be another employment question on the sampling, which is slightly different. So it's not a repeat, and I'll show you that. And then the most controversial question on the sheet that was introduced for the first time was an income question. And they put it as the last question up there because they knew it was controversial about it, how much money you received in wages. If you made $5,000 or more, then you just put that down. As you can see, 5,000 plus. And 75% of Americans made less than $5,000 in 1940. A number of people refused to answer that question, 2.3%. You can see here, refused. The income questions were first discussed in 1929, and a number of groups requested it, from federal boards, labor, business interests, It was approved by two committees, the Census Director and the Secretary of Commerce. But yet there was still a pushback, major pushback. And it was led by Senator Toby. He went on radio and appealed to the U.S. for a national strike against the census. It was really ugly. And the census director was forced to compromise. So I'll show you the compromise. Let's assume I'm your 1940 enumerator. No, I'm missing something. I certainly don't look as nice as this person. I'm missing her card. Well, I can solve that problem having a card. That's relatively easy to do, and figure out a photograph that I can put in sepia. Yeah, that looks all right. And I come to you and I say, hey, here I am. I'm sworn not to disclose any portion thereof to any person except my superior officers. And the person says, you're kidding. That's not going to work for me. So I say, as a compromise, here's a one small sheet of paper. It's in my collection. It asks the questions. You can fill this out in private, and you don't have to sign it. But before I give you the sheet, I have put down on the bottom the state, the sheet number, the enumeration district number, and the line number. And after you finish doing that, I have an envelope here. I want you to put that in the envelope and seal it, and I will mail it. Now, it kind of doesn't make sense to me today that the person who didn't trust you with the answer trusts you with a sealed envelope. But that was the thing, and you were supposed to mail the envelope into the census office. And there is the questions that were asked, which are basically on the regular one. And I wrote the letter C, confidential, on the schedule itself. So if you see C, and maybe the person gave you a blank number. And here's one where you can see that the wages are in pencil. They were put in later. And it says, I guess it says census information mailed. If we look at the supplemental questions, remember these are the sampling questions. It does ask for the birthplace of the person's father and mother. It asks for whether the person is a veteran or not, and which war they fought in, and there are the instructions for the enumerators on the bottom. It doesn't ask for your social security number, but it does ask whether you have a social security card, which started in 1930s. 1935, President Roosevelt signed the bill. It asks for your usual occupation, industry, and class of worker. Now, before, on the regular thing, it asks what you were actually doing. And you can see the difference between it when people were desperate for jobs during the Great Depression. And there was a large concern about falling birth rates. This is what's called an age distribution. Because of economic conditions, people were making choices not to have children. And normally you would expect that an age group, let's say of 0 to 4 or 5 to 9, would be higher than some of the other columns. But it's not. There was a depression. So the demographers asked to have questions on women who are or have been married, questions about marriage, age at first marriage, and number of children. And there was a pushback from some people in the population. There was one person who testified in Congress that instead of putting money into national defense, they should put in money into building jails for women who refused to answer these questions. Luckily, we didn't. So that's an overview of the 1940 Census Schedule. It is open to the public right now. There are name indexes, free name indexes, and I hope that this increased your knowledge about it and what's on the schedule and how to search for it. This has been another of my JDW talks. I anticipate having a dozen or more, not too much more than that, on YouTube. And I hope you enjoy it. And if you do, please spread the word. Thank you.